Over 100,000 people died building a single railway. Not in a war zone, not due to a natural disaster. They died because the work itself was the disaster. That line, forced through the jungles of Southeast Asia under military occupation, stands as one of the most inhumane engineering projects of the 20th century, and it is the final stop in today's 13-story journey across the world's most extreme railways. Why do railways reveal so much about human ambition? Because a railroad cannot lie. It either exists or it doesn't. Someone had to decide to lay track across vertical cliff faces, over the surface of a pink salt lake, above a raging ocean, through Saharan heat and Andean clouds. And then someone had to actually do it. Some of those decisions killed thousands. Some produced lines that now exist only as rust and memory. Others, defying every rational calculation, are still running. A train that glides across a lake the colour of a sunset, its wheels skimming water so still it looks like a mirror. A bamboo platform, barely a cart, hurtling without brakes down broken Cambodian rails. A rusted viaduct in the Burmese jungle where the only safe speed is walking pace, because anything faster risks swinging the whole structure into collapse. A passenger route in the Argentine Andes at 4,000 meters altitude, where oxygen thins enough to make travelers lose consciousness. A coal mine beneath the ocean floor in Japan, where temperatures hit 45 degrees Celsius a kilometre underground. 13 routes, 13 violations, of physics, of safety, of reason, of fear. Different centuries, different continents, one shared quality. A normal person had no business boarding these trains. And yet people did. That is exactly what we are here to understand. A working freight train runs through a lake, not across a bridge, not along the shore, directly through the water, its wheels turning beneath the surface of a red inland sea in southwestern Siberia. That single fact is enough to make Lake Berlinsko, near the town of Slavgorod in Russia's Altai region, one of the strangest operational railway settings on Earth. It is our number 13, and the unease it generates is slow, quiet, and persistent. The colour comes first. The lake's water ranges from pale pink to a deep, saturated crimson, depending on season and temperature. The cause is biological. Dunaliella salina algae and halophilic bacteria thrive in conditions that would kill almost anything else, and they produce beta-carotene in large quantities as a biochemical response to osmotic stress. That pigment saturates every cubic centimetre of the brine. The lake covers roughly 21 square kilometres, and in a hot summer, its salinity exceeds even that of the Dead Sea. The railway came later, but it is equally improbable. Salt extraction at Berlinsko dates to the 18th century, when the lake supplied a significant portion of Western Siberia's salt needs. Soviet industrialization replaced hand labor with machinery and laid a narrow-gauge line directly across the lakebed. The water here is extraordinarily shallow, in many sections only a few dozen centimeters deep, which made it practical to lay track on the bottom and run trains through the brine rather than around it. The line has never been decommissioned. Trains still cross several times each day. The visual result is difficult to process. The carriages, perpetually bathed in salt water, accumulate thick white mineral crusts along their sides. Metal becomes mineral, machine becomes formation. The train does not look like it is travelling through a landscape, it looks like it is slowly becoming part of one. Railways in this series earn their entries through extremity. Sometimes that means altitude, collapse, or catastrophe. Number 13 earns its place through atmosphere alone. No one falls, nothing breaks. A train simply moves across red water under a flat steppe sky, and the wrongness of it lingers long after the image fades. 12 inches. That is roughly the clearance between a moving train and the edge of a market stall at Maeklong Railway Market in Samut Songkhram Province, about 50 miles southwest of Bangkok. Not a decommissioned track preserved as a curiosity, not a scheduled tourist experience with safety barriers and timed entry. An active rail line operated by the State Railway of Thailand, running 8 times a day straight through one of the most densely packed fresh markets in the country. The reason this arrangement exists is not negligence or regulatory oversight. It is simply a matter of sequence. The railway came first. The market grew around it over more than a century, stall by stall, canopy by canopy, until the tracks disappeared beneath layers of produce, spice, and commerce. By the time the density reached its current level, the coexistence had already become routine. Today, the mechanics of that routine are almost meditative to watch. A signal sounds. Without breaking stride or conversation, vendors fold back their striped awnings, nudge their baskets of fish and vegetables a few centimeters off the rails, and wait. The train eases through at low speed, its flanks passing within arm's reach of hanging onions, stacked crates, and neatly arranged seafood displays. Then the last car clears the bend, the canopies unfurl again, the baskets slide back into position, and trading resumes without a beat lost. What makes Maeklong number 12 on this list is the precise quality of that nonchalance. The vendors are not performing composure for an audience. They have simply done this thousands of times. The train is not an interruption to the market. It is a recurring event within it, like a delivery truck or a rainstorm, acknowledged, accommodated, forgotten. Nowhere else on Earth does daily human commerce sit in quite such intimate, indifferent proximity to several hundred tons of moving steel. Number 11 on our list was built for workers, not tourists, and it shows. The Gelmerbahn funicular in the Swiss canton of Bern was never meant to impress anyone. Constructed in 1920 to haul construction crews and materials up to the Gelmer Dam site in the Hasletal Valley, it was engineered for pure utility. Steel cables, wooden cars, a track cut directly into the rock face with no embankment, no weather protection, no excess. What it became a century later is one of the most viscerally unsettling rides in Europe. The numbers give you part of the picture. A gradient of 46 degrees makes it one of the steepest funiculars on the continent. The vertical rise runs to roughly 396 meters. The destination is the Gelmersee Reservoir, high in the Bernese Oberland. But numbers don't explain why passengers grip the handrails before the car even starts moving. The explanation is architectural. The Gelmerbahn has no real sidewalls. The car is open in a way that modern transport design actively avoids, not because it is unsafe, but because it removes every visual buffer between the passenger and the exposure. The handrails are there, the braking system is certified, the cables are inspected. None of that matters to the part of the brain that looks down a near vertical alpine slope and simply refuses to feel calm about it. This gap between documented safety and felt danger is what places the Gelmerbahn on this list. It is not a thrill ride engineered for adrenaline. It is a piece of functional infrastructure over 100 years old that happens to produce the same effect. The dam builders of 1920 had no interest in sensation. They needed a reliable machine. They built one. And that machine, unchanged in its essential character, still runs every summer above the Hasletal, carrying passengers who came for a view and discovered something considerably harder to shake. From here, our list moves in the opposite direction, not up an alpine face, but down beneath the surface, and eventually beneath the floor of an ocean. There is exactly one rule governing traffic on the Battambang bamboo train. Whoever is carrying less steps aside, no signals, no dispatcher, no right of way based on direction or speed, just weight and load, settled on the spot. That single improvised protocol is the entire safety system for a railway running at 50 kilometres per hour across broken colonial-era tracks in northwestern Cambodia. The vehicle itself is called a nori, a word most likely borrowed from the French lorry, meaning a flat utility cart. The design matches the name without apology. A bamboo platform, roughly 1 metre by 3, set on 2 metal axles, fitted with wheels stripped from old agricultural or military equipment, powered by a small petrol engine pulled from a water pump or a generator, with a drive belt connecting the motor to one axle. No cab, no suspension worth mentioning, no braking distance that would satisfy any modern standard. The tracks beneath it were laid during French colonial rule. They absorbed a Japanese occupation, a brutal civil war, and the Khmer Rouge regime, which methodically dismantled Cambodia's infrastructure, including the railway network. By the late 20th century, the Pamban line was a warped and neglected strip of metal with protruding sleepers and subsided embankments, largely abandoned by the state rail system. Local necessity filled that gap. Farmers, traders and passengers began building and operating norries because something had to move goods and people. And this was what was available. When two platforms meet head-on, the lighter one is lifted off its axles, moved to the side of the track and reassembled once the other has passed. The whole process takes a few minutes and happens without ceremony because it has always happened that way. Ranking 10th among the world's most unsettling rail phenomena, the Cambodian bamboo train sits at the intersection of ingenuity and precariousness in a way that is difficult to categorize as either charming or dangerous, because it is plainly both. The next entry on this list moves the threat from ground level to altitude, where thin air becomes the hazard. Hundreds of people willingly climb into open wagons filled with raw iron ore, ride for up to 17 hours through the Saharan desert, and consider it their only option. There is no road, there is no bus, there is no alternative. That paradox lands the Mauritania iron ore train at number 9 on our list, not because the infrastructure is failing, but because the conditions it operates in are genuinely extreme. The train exists for one industrial purpose: moving iron ore from the mining town of Zurate in northern Mauritania to the Atlantic port of Nouadhibou, 720 kilometres away. The state-owned company SNIM has been extracting iron from Zurate since the 1960s, and this railway is the only viable link between those deposits and the ocean. No roads cross this stretch of desert, no settlements break the landscape. Nothing exists out there except sand, heat, and rails. The scale of the operation is striking. At full load, the train can stretch to 2.5 kilometres, pull up to 220 wagons, and weigh more than 20,000 tonnes, placing it among the heaviest trains on Earth. 2 or 3 locomotives anchor the front, with more sometimes embedded mid-train to manage the pull across the flat, brutal terrain. But the reason this train captures attention beyond the engineering world is simpler. Ordinary people ride it. Fishermen heading back to the coast, nomads crossing between regions, traders, migrants, families. They climb onto the ore wagons, find a space between the rocks of dark red mineral, and wait. Daytime temperatures exceed 50 degrees Celsius. After sunset, the desert turns cold with little warning. Iron dust settles on skin and coats the lungs. The train does not stop for passengers. It does not slow down for them to board safely. They manage on their own terms. This is not a tourist experience that someone curated. It is infrastructure in its most unadorned form. A single line connecting isolated communities to the outside world, crossing one of the most unforgiving environments on the planet. Raw, demanding, and quietly remarkable. Where Mauritania tests you with nature, the next entry on our list tests you with something different. The accumulated weight of history and the precarious geometry of structures built over open water. A train was swallowed whole by the sea. That is not a metaphor. In December 1964, a passenger train was crossing the Pamban Bridge when a cyclone of exceptional force struck the coast. The waves took the entire train into the strait below. More than 100 people died. The exact toll was never fully confirmed. Ranked number 8 among the world's most extreme structures, the Pamban Bridge carries that history in its steel, whether passengers know it or not. The bridge itself is a marvel of early industrial ambition. Completed in 1914, it became India's first railway sea bridge, stretching nearly 2 kilometres across the Palk Strait between the Tamil Nadu mainland and Rameswaram Island. British engineers designed it in an era that treated the taming of nature as a marker of progress. The physical reality of the structure reflects that confidence. Massive steel trusses, a track that sits just meters above the water's surface, and at the center, a manually operated bascule span that still opens and closes today exactly as it did over a century ago. No upgraded mechanism, no automation. The original engineering unchanged. What the original engineers could not engineer away is the sea itself. Salt air attacks the metal continuously. During storms, waves do not merely rise near the tracks, they break across them. The bridge sways in high winds, forcing train drivers to cut their speed to near nothing. Every crossing in bad weather is a negotiation. The 1964 disaster did not close the bridge permanently. Repairs were made, service resumed, and the trains kept running, as they still do today, over the exact water that once proved how little a century of engineering means when a storm decides otherwise. That is the paradox Pamban presents, a structure rebuilt after catastrophe, operating on century-old mechanisms, asking passengers to trust both. Every single crossing. A doctor is required on every single departure, not occasionally, not in special circumstances. Every time the Tren a las Nubes leaves Salta, a physician boards with it. That detail, more than any statistic, explains what kind of journey this is. Number 7 on our list sits at 4,220 meters above sea level at its highest point, the viaduct of La Polvoria. At that altitude, the atmosphere delivers roughly half the oxygen available at sea level. The human body is not designed for this. Blood pressure shifts, vision blurs, lungs labour against air that feels physically thin. The oxygen cylinders lining the passenger cars are not props for atmosphere. They are functional medical equipment used on a regular basis. The route itself is a feat of early 20th century engineering stubbornness. The original goal was straightforward in concept and staggering in execution. Connect Argentina's inland plains to Chilean Pacific ports across the Andes. The solution required 434 kilometers of track, laid across terrain that resisted every conventional approach. Engineers answered with 29 bridges, 21 tunnels, 13 viaducts, 12 switchbacks, and 2 complete spiral loops. The train does not travel in a straight line. It reverses, spirals, climbs back over ground it has already crossed. Passengers watch the same ridge appear on 3 different sides of the train before it finally falls behind. The landscape shifts as the altitude climbs. The dry foothills give way to the Altiplano, a high plateau where the ground is crusted with salt, the rocks are the colour of rust and ash, and the silence is the kind that presses against your ears. Nothing grows here, nothing moves except the train. La Polvoria arrives as a climax. The steel arch structure stretches 224 meters across a canyon 63 meters deep. When the train moves onto it, slowly, deliberately, passengers find themselves suspended between rock and sky, with no other reference point in sight. No trees, no water, no horizon in any familiar sense. The Tren a las Nubes does not reach the 7,000 meters where altitude becomes immediately life-threatening. It does not need to. 4,220 meters is enough to put a doctor on the payroll and keep the oxygen ready. Next on our list is the Pamban Bridge in India, where the threat is not the sky above, but the ocean below, and where the sea has already claimed one train in full. For over 130 years, a train has been climbing a near vertical cliff in the Swiss Alps, and it has never once derailed. That record isn't luck. It's the direct result of an engineering solution so counterintuitive that it took decades before anyone believed it could work. This is the Pilatusbahn, number 6 on our list, and it remains to this day the steepest rack railway on the planet. The mountain itself has always inspired unease. Long before the railway existed, locals believed the summit of Mount Pilatus was haunted by the restless spirit of Pontius Pilate, and that the dense fogs rolling across its ridges were omens of storms and misfortune. In 1889, engineer Eduard Locher chose this 2,000-metre peak as the site of an experiment that most of his peers considered reckless. The gradient on Pilatus reaches 48 degrees in places. That's not a steep hill, that's closer to a wall. Conventional rack systems, the kind that work on every other mountain railway in the region, rely on a vertical toothed rail gripped from above. At 48 degrees, that grip fails. The wheel loses contact and the carriage slides back. Locher's answer was to throw out the entire assumption. Instead of gripping the rail from above, his system uses 2 horizontal toothed wheels that clamp the rack from both sides simultaneously. The train doesn't ride on the rail so much as it locks around it. Nothing short of destroying the mechanism itself can separate the two. The carriages are also built with a forward tilt so that the floor stays roughly level during the climb. Without that tilt, passengers would be pressed against the front wall for the entire journey. The 5-kilometre ascent takes close to 30 minutes at a maximum speed of 9 kilometres per hour. That speed limit exists not because the engine lacks power, but because at that gradient, any abrupt change in motion carries consequences that cannot be undone. In winter, the line closes entirely. Avalanches and ice make the slope impassable, even for this machine. What follows on our list trades this slow, relentless vertical crawl for something far more violent. A series of sharp reversals on an Andean cliff face where human ambition met the limits of the possible. The train goes up by going backward. That is not a metaphor, and it is not a malfunction. It is the only engineering solution that worked. Welcome to number 5 on our list, the Nariz del Diablo, Devil's Nose, in the central Andes of Ecuador, where a single mountain forced engineers to invent a geometry of ascent that still has no real equivalent anywhere on Earth. Here is the paradox at the heart of this place. The railway exists precisely because the obstacle was considered insurmountable. When construction began in 1899, the goal was to connect Ecuador's Pacific coast to the high-altitude capital of Quito. The central Andes stood in the way, and near the town of Alausi, the basalt cliffs dropped nearly 800 meters, sheer, vertical, unforgiving. No conventional gradient could handle it. No tunnel was feasible. The mountain simply said no. So the engineers said yes anyway, and designed a switchback. The train climbs to a ledge, stops, reverses onto a higher ledge, stops again, repeating the sequence until it has clawed its way up the rock face like a hand finding holds on a climbing wall. The rails are a metre wide, laid on a shelf of stone you could cross in a few strides. To the right of the train, nothing. 800 metres of nothing. Building those ledges cost more than steel and dynamite. Between 1899 and 1908, thousands of workers, Ecuadorians and Jamaicans, brought in on contracts that bore little resemblance to free labour, were lowered on ropes down the basalt faces to chip footholds by hand. Death tolls were significant and poorly recorded. The mountain extracted its price before it allowed the tracks. For much of the route's history, passengers rode on the rooftops of the carriages. From up there, the view directly below was not ground. It was the Chan Chan River Canyon dissolving into haze hundreds of meters down. Today, the tourist train moves through slowly, safely. The geometry, however, is unchanged. The Devil's Nose remains what it has always been, proof that when humans and mountains negotiate, the mountain sets the terms. Next on our list, a void of an entirely different kind. The speed limit on the Gotek Viaduct is 14 kilometres per hour, not because of colonial-era regulations that nobody updated, but because going faster risks setting the entire structure into resonant vibration that engineers no longer trust they can control. That single fact tells you almost everything you need to know about bridge number 4 on this list. Gotek hangs over a gorge 102 metres deep in Shan State, Myanmar. For most of the year, the canyon floor is invisible beneath a thick layer of tropical fog, which means passengers crossing by train look out the window and see nothing below the rails. No ground, no reference point, just a white void where the earth should be. The bridge was built in 1901 by American engineers from Pennsylvania Steel, commissioned by the British colonial administration to connect Mandalay with the remote highland provinces of Shan State. The entire construction was completed in under a year. At the time of its opening, Gotek was the largest bridge structure in the British Empire. That record has long since passed to other structures, but the viaduct itself has not fundamentally changed. The same riveted lattice of trusses and vertical columns that went up in under 12 months in 1901 is the same structure carrying trains today. More than 120 years of monsoons, heat, and operational stress have done what one might expect. Rust bleeds through successive layers of paint. Certain rivets are held in place more by habit than by engineering integrity, and the maintenance program the structure would require has never been fully delivered. Paul Theroux crossed Gotek in the 1970s and described it as a cobweb of rusty lace over nothing. The lace is rustier now. The crossing takes several long minutes. The metal groans quietly. The carriages sway. Below, the fog holds its position and gives nothing away. Number 3. Nobody stole these trains, and nobody destroyed them. Someone simply walked away and left them there. And that turns out to be far more devastating than any act of sabotage. The Uyuni Train Cemetery, sitting on the edge of Bolivia's Salar de Uyuni, the largest salt flat on Earth, is a graveyard of over 100 locomotives and rail cars that have been rusting in the open air since the 1940s. No fences, no guards, no roof. Just steel slowly dissolving into the Andean sky. To understand why, you have to go back to the late 19th century when Bolivia was flush with mineral wealth. Silver, tin, and ore were locked inside high-altitude mines across the Altiplano, and British engineering companies saw the opportunity. They laid rail lines designed to do one thing: move that wealth down to the Pacific coast as fast as possible. Uyuni became the central hub of the entire network, a junction point sitting at roughly 3,600 meters above sea level. The locomotives, predominantly British-built, hauled heavy loads across one of the most extreme environments on the planet. Then the economics reversed. Deposits ran thin. Global commodity prices dropped. Political instability made investment pointless. Indigenous communities, who had resisted the railway's expansion onto their lands from the beginning, intensified their opposition. By the 1940s, the routes were bleeding money. Repairs were neither funded nor attempted. The machines were shunted to a siding at the desert's edge, and the people who ran them simply left. What followed was not dramatic, it was geological. Salt crystals and dry altitude air work like a slow acid, eating through steel over decades rather than days. Hull plates are perforated through and through. Glass is gone. Metal has warped into ragged shapes that no longer resemble the engineered precision they once were. The visual effect is one of the most starkly apocalyptic on Earth. A white, infinite plain, a brutally blue sky, and rows of steel skeletons stripped of everything animate. Today, the site is open to tourists with no restrictions whatsoever. You can climb inside any locomotive you choose. That freedom is itself unsettling. The corroded metal is holding together by the thinnest margin. Here, death arrived slowly, measured in decades of rust and neglect. The next entry on our list operates on a very different timeline. There, the danger is immediate and every journey is a gamble. The most dangerous coal mine railway in Japan was never on an island. It was beneath the ocean floor, running through flooded darkness in Fukuoka Prefecture, and almost no one outside the industry ever knew it existed. Nakanoshima Undersea Coal Mine Railway ranks second among Japan's most harrowing forgotten industrial sites, yet it receives a fraction of the attention lavished on Hiroshima. The reason is partly geography and partly the particular way this place preferred to keep its secrets underground. The logic of its danger was compounding. Miners descended more than 1 kilometre below sea level in narrow iron carts, cramped enough that a grown man had to fold himself nearly horizontal to fit inside. There were no individual controls on those carts. Speed was a function of gravity and incline, nothing more. A derailment at that depth was categorically different from an accident at the surface. A rescue operation 1 kilometre beneath the ocean floor takes time measured in hours, and the survival window for an injured miner in that environment was far shorter. The heat at the deepest working faces reached 45 degrees Celsius, the kind of sustained heat that industrial furnaces produce, not mine tunnels. Moisture seeped through the rock continuously, a reminder that the ocean overhead was not an abstraction, but a physical pressure held back by geology. Methane concentrated in the passages. A single spark struck against a rail was enough to change everything. These conditions existed simultaneously, every shift, for decades. Today the mine is abandoned, and the carts sit exactly where the last crew left them. The rails disappear into water. Nothing on the surface marks what happened here or what it cost. Every metre of this railway cost roughly 1 human life. That is not a metaphor or a rhetorical device. It is the historian's estimate, and it places the Burma Railway, known to the world as the Death Railway, at the top of any list of rail lines defined by human suffering. Number 1. The Japanese military command ordered its construction in 1942 with a deadline that engineers called impossible. 415 kilometres of track through the jungle mountains and malarial swamps between Thailand and Burma, completed in under 18 months. The impossibility was not reconsidered. It was outsourced to human endurance. More than 250,000 people were forced onto the project. Allied prisoners of war from Britain, Australia, the Netherlands and the United States, alongside hundreds of thousands of Asian Ramusha labourers conscripted under occupation. They worked without heavy machinery, using pickaxes, basic hand tools and bare hands under the continuous watch of guards who enforced pace with violence. Tropical disease did the rest. Cholera, malaria, dysentery and starvation killed at a rate that turned a construction site into something closer to a slow execution. Historians estimate that over 100,000 people died before the line was complete. 2 sites along the route have come to represent the whole. Hellfire Pass, a rock cutting hacked by hand through night shifts lit only by torches and open fires, the burning hillside visible for miles as something resembling the entrance to hell. And the bridge over the River Kwai, whose post-war film adaptation gave the railway its global profile, though the real story carries a weight the film never quite reached. Both sites are now memorial zones, visited each year by descendants of the dead from across the world. The Death Railway is next on our list, not because of its engineering scale, but because of what it reveals about the decision to treat human beings as raw material. Up next, an underwater coal mine in Japan, where workers were lowered in iron cages to dig a kilometre beneath the ocean floor. Over 100,000 people died so that a train could run. That is not a metaphor. That is the construction toll of a single railway line, 415 kilometres long, now known as the Death Road. It is the most extreme answer in a list of 13 to a question every engineer and every passenger eventually faces. How far is too far? Each of the 13 routes on this map push that boundary in a different direction. In Cambodia, bamboo platforms bolted onto salvaged axles race down wartime rails with no signals and no rules. A transit system invented by people who had nothing left but the tracks themselves. In Mauritania, a freight train 3 kilometres long hauls iron ore across the Sahara, and on its iron flanks ride people for whom this is the only available road across the desert. In Bolivia, rust and salt are slowly completing what neglect started, a graveyard of locomotives that no government ever came back to reclaim. In Switzerland, twice, the mountains forced engineers to choose between the impossible and the ingenious. One line climbs by rack and pinion against gradients that defeat conventional wheels. Another winds through the Alps at angles that redefine what a railway is allowed to do. In Ecuador, the only route forward is backward first, a switchback carved into a cliff face where the train reverses direction to descend. In India, a bridge over the ocean carries the memory of a tsunami that swallowed an entire train in minutes. In Japan, a coal mine beneath the ocean floor made darkness and extreme heat standard working conditions for decades. 13 routes. 13 different definitions of necessity, courage, and cost. The answers are never the same. The outcome always is. If this list changed how you look at your own station platform, like and subscribe. The next route is already waiting.